Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Woon, and welcome to the YMyHealth podcast. Today, we're joined by Shruti Nair, a licensed mental health counselor who takes culturally informed approach to therapy. She works with adults navigating anxiety, depression, life transitions, and the lasting effects of intergenerational trauma. Using evidence-based approaches such as CBT, DBT, and psychodynamic therapy, Shruti helps clients build insight, self-compassion, and real change. We're excited to have her here to discuss intergenerational trauma.
Thank you, Julie.
Oh.
I was
Perfect.
like,
Okay, thank you.
respond to that.
I appreciate it. Shruti, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I want to start by kind of framing this topic and giving people a little bit of context as we delve in. So just for somebody who maybe doesn't know what intergenerational or transgenerational trauma is, can you give us like a clinical definition?
Yeah, absolutely. Intergenerational trauma is sort of the transmission of trauma's effects, meaning
Mhm.
emotional, it could be psychological, it could be behavioral from those who experienced it to descendants who did not directly. So, often through learned behaviors, altered parenting, things like beliefs, or even epigenetics can actually manifest itself as anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, or other issues. And typically, the source of that can come in the form like things such as war, abuse, systemic oppression, or even cultural trauma. And I also want to add, because I think it is not often talked about, how there are actually different types of intergenerational trauma. And it depends on how the trauma is originated and how it gets passed down as well. And there's actually a couple that I would love to name. One is called family based trauma. So, this is where trauma comes from experiences like abuse, neglect, domestic violence, or even addiction. The second one is historical trauma. So, this actually involves trauma experienced by an entire group. So, things like genocide, enslavement, colonization, forced migration, or even cultural erasure can be just some examples of that. The third is systemic or even structural intergenerational trauma. So, this is trauma that continues not just through families, but it can go run through institutions, laws, policies, housing, education, and or healthcare as well. And there's three more I also want to list, which is war-related trauma. So families affected by war, refugees, asylum seekers are often carry trauma-related, such as violence, loss, and even survival. There's also chronic medical trauma as well. So, this is exposure to things such as environmental disasters or unethical medical experimentation, which can really affect the trust you might have in institutions and even caregivers. And then the last one is silence trauma. So, this is trauma that was never named, never processed, or even allowed to even be spoken about. There may not even be stories, even language. It's just the emotional residue that's sort of left over. So, for example, like children can sense it sometimes when they're growing up, where they feel the tension or like the avoidance, the unspoken rules in the family household. So, what I really want to highlight here is that these different types that I just listed here actually can overlap. So most people don't just carry just one. So, for example, a family can hold personal trauma, collective trauma, and systemic trauma all at once. So that's just something I think to really highlight and just keep in mind as well. And also, again, this is not about pathology being quote unquote passed down like a curse. It is about sort of adaptations that are sort of being inherited in environments shaped by past harm. So, truly understanding the different types of intergenerational trauma not only can help therapists such as myself, but also people who may be struggling with this as well, which typically helps and aids in figuring out where healing really needs to happen. So, is it in the nervous system? Is it in relationships? Is it in narratives? Or is it in the larger kind of like social world that we like to name? So,
Yeah. I didn't realize that there were so many types. I think there is, a little bit that people kind of innately understand just in hearing the term, but to go through and understand the different ways that this could come through, I think is super interesting. And I'm curious how intergenerational trauma might differ from individual trauma.
yeah, absolutely. So this is often, especially like the clients that I see, really struggle with that, in really understanding this difference. So, let me first off by saying that individual trauma is more defined as it's more about what happened to you. Intergenerational trauma is about what happened before you and how your system adapted to it anyway. So, with individual trauma, there's usually a very clear event or period that explains like certain symptoms. So, the nervous system truly learned that danger was real and reorganized around survival. Versus intergenerational trauma works differently. A person may not have a trauma story of their own that fully explains what they feel. But instead, they might actually grow up inside like families, relationships, or even cultures shaped by someone else's trauma. So the nervous system is sort of learning about danger indirectly. So this could be through parenting patterns, emotional rules, or even unspoken fears. And one more difference I really want to highlight is how it's stored. So, individual trauma is often tied to specific memories. Intergenerational trauma shows up as like beliefs, expectations, or even chronic vigilance without a really clear origin. So, really understanding this difference can often shift the story from, hey, like what's wrong with me to what adaptations did I inherit and do I still need them?
Yeah. That's, I think, such a great way to put it. And like I said, there are so many types of uh, intergenerational trauma that I hadn't necessarily like recognized. Are there common misconceptions people have about intergenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma versus individual?
Yes, there's so many, but I think I'm only gonna name just a few that I think are very common. So, and they're actually really worth sort of clearing up as well because they really shape how seriously the concept is taken. So let me start with naming one big misconception, which is intergenerational trauma means people are inheriting memories. So that's typically not how it works. So people who struggle with intergenerational trauma are not born remembering like wars, abuse, or displacement. Those things are typically experienced by the generation before them or the generation before that. So what truly gets passed down here are patterns. So it's ways of like relating to others, regulating emotion, responding to stress, interpreting the world. So it is truly learned adaptation, not a stored memory. The second one I think I want to emphasize here is it's all genetic and therefore unavoidable. So while there's emerging research showing that epigenetics can influence stress response systems. I typically say that intergenerational trauma is not destiny, quote unquote, written in DNA. Genes may influence vulnerability, but there's also environment playing a role. There are relationships, there's meaning making involved here, which matter as much. And those things can be changeable. So the third one is trauma only applies to extreme historical events. So, like things like genocide, slavery, war, poverty, those are really like important examples. But it can show up in families like affected by like chronic neglect or addiction or systemic discrimination. So I typically share with my clients that you don't really need a history book level catastrophe for trauma to truly be transmitted. There's a couple of other ones that I'm also, I think, for your listeners to really keep in mind. Another common misunderstanding is talking about intergenerational trauma is about blaming parents or ancestors. Clinically, what I've seen is it's just the opposite. It's about understanding that there are many harmful patterns, but they were like once survival strategies at some point long back, and we may not be able to really point back to that time. The next one is this belief that if you had a quote unquote good enough childhood, that intergenerational trauma cannot apply. And I typically say that that is a huge misconception. You can truly have loving caregivers and still grow up inside a system organized around fear, silence, or even loss. So the way it's transmitted can be very subtle. So such examples could be overprotection, emotional avoidance, and it's not just like overt harm. And then the last one I think I want to really name is that intergenerational trauma explains everything. It really does not. It's actually a framework, and not a universal answer. So not every struggle is trauma related. So I usually say that overusing the concept can really flatten sometimes individual experiences or even ignore present day stressors. So again, the goal here is to really recognize how survival can really travel across time. And again, with awareness and the support, I truly believe like healing can really travel forward as well. Mm.
Yeah. And I'm so curious because I was initially introduced to this through the book The Body Keeps the Score. And I've just noticed that this topic is becoming more visible in mental health conversations as well as just like general culture. And so I'm curious why you think it's becoming more visible right now.
So I think there are a couple of reasons. The first one I will say is that finally the language caught up to people's like lived experience. So for example, like for years, like symptoms like anxiety or relationship struggles were sort of treated in isolation without looking at like family history or systems. So truly trauma informed care really changed that. I also have seen a generational shift, so many people now have enough safety and distance. Again, that is a generalization, but for the most part, that is true to be able to ask questions that their parents or even their grandparents could not. So that is something I've also witnessed, that these earlier generations focused on just surviving. And this generation is now trying to like understand it and really try to understand like how was like that moment, whether it was war or poverty or neglect, how does that show up in my nervous system at the moment? And also I think conversations about identity, like power, things like systemic harm have grown as well over the couple of years. And I think it's become harder to see trauma as only individual. And intergenerational trauma really, I think, explores how this historical harm really continues to live in bodies and families as well. So, and I think the last point I really want to make on maybe why it is more visible here is that it actually offers relief to become aware of how your history or your past history may be influencing your present. And that the reason why is truly because it replaces self blame with context. So helping people see that this pain didn't just start with them, and the healing doesn't have to end with them. And I think that's a important thing that I have witnessed in my work with clients. Mm.
Yeah. And looking a little bit at like the actual experience, how does this show up emotionally or behaviorally with individuals?
Yeah. So I guess with intergenerational trauma, how it shows up in someone's life. I typically say it often doesn't announce itself as quote unquote trauma. Many of us don't always have that language or even being able to identify it as such. So it actually shows up as patterns. So that means emotional reactions and behaviors that make sense once you understand where they came from. So let's first talk about maybe how it shows up emotionally. So there are a couple of signs. So one of the most common sign is chronic anxiety without a clear source. So a person may feel constantly on edge or bracing for something to go wrong, even when life feels relatively stable. And the nervous system in that moment is acting as if danger is right in front of them because that was the emotional climate it was shaped in. Another emotional pattern is like emotional numbing or like restricted affect is something I have witnessed. So some people don't feel anxious so much as disconnected from their emotions. So they may not be able to feel like joy, anger, maybe even may not even feel anxiety. And so this often comes from families or cultures where emotional expression was not safe or quote unquote was seen as liability. And then there's also inherited grief or sadness. So people may carry a sense of loss that doesn't quite belong to their own story. And clinically, this is just something I think us as therapists hear a lot in families affected by like displacement, cultural loss, or even unacknowledged historical trauma. Behaviorally, I've seen it show up as like hyper responsibility and like over functioning. So, for example, people become caretakers very early on and feel responsible for others' like emotion or believe rest is dangerous or undeserved. And again, survival once depended on them being able to stay useful, vigilant, or strong, and hence why there is that feeling as if, oh, wait, I can't take rest in this present moment, for example, because of the connotation, the meaning that is linked from we don't even know sometimes. It might be a generation before that. On the other end of the spectrum, it can show up as avoidance as well. So avoiding conflict, closeness, vulnerability, or even success. So if earlier generations learned that visibility or attachment led to harm, avoidance can kind of become a quiet survival strategy. And then another one I think is relationship patterns is another major area. So intergenerational trauma can lead to sort of difficulty with trust and intimacy, like kind of oscillating between craving that closeness and pushing people away. And this typically reflects attachment systems shaped by these caregivers. So and then, of course, I think a lot of research have shown, and also the work that I have done over the years, that trauma lives in the body as well. So maybe we're not very conscious. Our mind may not tell us or even indicate to us that we are going through a traumatic moment or experience or inheriting those patterns, but our body is sort of holding on to quote unquote like chronic tension, fatigue, pain, or even stress related illness, headaches, GI issues sometimes. So again, the body carries what was never spoken or processed, and especially when trauma was like silenced for a very long time.
Yeah. And you touched on this a little bit earlier, but can intergenerational trauma exist even if someone hasn't experienced obvious traumatic events themselves?
Yeah, that's such a good question because it's one of the most confusing things about intergenerational trauma is exactly that. Answer to that question is yes. Even if you have never experienced that traumatic event, you can still experience the impact that intergenerational trauma has, and people can really carry these real trauma responses for sure. So, from a clinical perspective, again, trauma is not only about what happened; it's about what did the nervous system learn about safety over the years. So for example, if you grew up in an environment shaped by someone else's unresolved trauma, your nervous system is going to adapt to that environment. So you don't need a single traumatic event. You actually learn through tone of voice sometimes, emotional availability, unpredictability, silence, overprotection, chronic stress. And again, over time, your body and your brain organize around this threat, even if the threat was indirect. So, something that I commonly, just some anecdotes I would love to share is I often see this in people who say things like, nothing terrible happened to me, but I've always been anxious, or my parents were loving, but something still felt off. And so I typically say that off feeling is often the residue of sort of living in a system organized around survival rather than safety. So another way you can think about this is individual trauma is more event based, and intergenerational trauma is often environmentally based.
Yeah.
So that environment carries the imprints of past trauma. And again, importantly, this doesn't mean everyone with anxious or depressive symptoms or any other presenting concern that they are actually experiencing this type of trauma. But it does mean that the absence of an obvious event does not rule trauma out. So, clinically, recognizing this can be very deeply relieving as well. So, again, it shifts the question from what is wrong with me to what did my system learn, and does it still need to live this way? And that's why talking about, I think, this topic really matters. It really explains how pain can be real and understandable even when it didn't begin with you.
Yeah. And what are some signs that someone might be carrying some of that intergenerational trauma and they're not realizing it?
Yeah, so I will say there are a couple of signs. So I typically emphasize physical or bodyal sort of sensations typically because sometimes it is very difficult to differentiate between is this like are my thoughts like related to this or not. And I always say like the body sometimes gives you more obvious signs than your mind. And so one thing I try to notice is um common nervous system physical manifestation signs such as like chronic stress responses. So like is your heart rate going up? Is your breathing a little bit heavy or becoming a lot heavier? It could be hypervigilance. So like looking at like tone of voice, it's like just subtle cues. Like it could be also how your body's reacting in like a fight or flight response. It could be shifts in anxiety in a more somatic sense. So like tight chest, stomach discomfort, tension like in the head, so headaches. Those are typically where I usually try to emphasize. But beyond those somatic moments, I think it's also reflecting upon like your, how you grew up. How do you show up at work? How do you show up in relationships? I think also can give you some signs as well. So relationships, there's some patterns maybe you can become aware of, such as like, are there trust issues? Is there an emotional distance or enmeshment going on? Are there conflict cycles that are repeating itself in terms of parenting or just the way your parents sort of raised you? It could be like overprotection, high expectation, or like achievement pressure on your kids. In terms of work, it could be perfectionism, difficulty setting boundaries, fear of failure, or even avoidance of risk or any form of instability. So those are another way to tell whether you are experiencing this type of trauma or not.
Yeah. Are there certain moments in adulthood where trauma tends to surface more clearly or things that could be maybe triggering?
So, I will say yes. So the way I will say in terms of triggers in the environment, I do think that if you tap into a relationship, for example, with a romantic partner, sometimes those attachment concerns, whether it's secure or anxious avoidant attachment styles, can show up. That could be signs of bringing back the old patterns. If you don't feel emotional safety, so emotional safety means the ability to be able to speak your mind out, to be able to um, sort of lean into and be honest with your emotions and be able to communicate that with the people around you. Those can also be triggers as well. Or even sometimes I usually say even cultural identity plays a huge role. as well. And it could also be a trigger in itself as well if your identity is sort of other people around you or the systems that you're part of is sort of doubting your sense of self. And how does that show up as well? How does that clash with the previous generation? So, your generation with your parents, with your grandparents, because again, there may be different values that are being clashed right there. So, that could be a trigger in itself. So, those are just some examples that I can share on maybe certain triggers in the environment that can repeat maybe some of those patterns that you may have experienced kind of growing up.
Sure. And what role does storytelling or the absence, I guess, of even telling family stories play in awareness of intergenerational trauma?
So I think stories are a very powerful tool. I typically say storytelling is sort of a bridge. So when families share stories about their history, so that typically can include struggles, it can include survival, it can include joy, or different joys in that person's life. It could be losses. It actually gives the next generation a map for understanding emotional patterns. So you start to see, oh, wait, that hypervigilance in me isn't just me. My parents lived through extreme scarcity and fear. So stories actually normalize emotions and coping strategies, and connecting behaviors to context rather than shame or self blame can be very helpful. As a therapist, I often, if there are any like storytelling or myths within the cultural identity of that individual, I find that very helpful in aiding in the healing journey for that individual. It really can validate experiences, and it can also give meaning to some inherited patterns as well. I will say the absence of stories, so when trauma is excuse me, when silent trauma is silenced or stories are withheld, that emotional residue still passes down. But children don't always get the context to make sense of it. So you might feel anxiety, grief, or hypervigilance, but then you don't quite have a narrative to anchor you. So this silence can often sort of foster into like confusion, it can foster into shame, or a sense that something is wrong with me. So inherited trauma also can become invisible as well if there are those absences of stories in your family system. And again, I think stories can also be tools for awareness and healing as well. So sharing even small, nuanced stories can help differentiate between inherited trauma from personal experience. So it allows people to sort of reframe survival behaviors as adaptation rather than like flaws. And I also find storytelling very can be very powerful because there are many cultures out there that identify as being very in tune or aligned with the collectivistic nature. And sometimes I actually view storytelling as something I like to call collective storytelling, where you can share it and build those deep, meaningful connections with families, with communities. And that alone can transform like patterns of like silence into meaning making. So again, I also want to emphasize that storytelling isn't just like for nostalgic meaning or sense, it's a clinical tool for insight. So the presence of stories can help illuminate those inherited trauma, and the absence of stories can also keep it invisible, or it can keep it embodied or unprocessed. So, again, awareness begins when narratives are acknowledged and heard and integrated because, as I said earlier, it is a bridge because it does bridge from starting with the past, it bridges the past, the present, and the future all together. And I think that's very, very empowering and powerful. Mm.
Yeah, I think you talked about some of these communities where they're like the culture of storytelling is, very important. I think on the other side of the coin, how do cultural norms around like silence or maybe more like resilience and like pushing through maybe affect healing for some individuals?
Yeah, so I typically look at cultural norms as having a double-edged sword. So with anything, I guess, in life, so leaning into a healthy coping mechanism, for example, and leaning into only that and just depending upon that, even though it's quote unquote healthy, engaging and only relying on that is maybe not the best way to move forward, or it may not heal a lot of those emotional wounds from within. Right. And so, in the same way, we can talk about cultural norms or things such as resilience or just pushing through as examples of that. So, for example, like, let's talk about maybe silence, right? And so in a lot of families and cultures, again, trauma is not talked about, and there's a lot of stigma around that. So people might avoid talking about these painful experiences, maybe to protect younger generations. Clinically, silence can create what I like to call unspoken inheritance. So children sense this tension, the fear, the grief, but they don't have the language to process it. And this can show up as anxiety, shame, or confusion in adulthood. And it can also lead to a lot of suppression within the family system, which then can impact the family dynamics that exist, whether it's with your great grandparents, your parents, your siblings. So that is something to also acknowledge as well.
Yeah.
Second, I think, is resilience. I think resilience, again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a very powerful quality or skill that might be an outcome of intergenerational trauma. However, oftentimes a lot of cultures use resilience as a form of not leaning into vulnerability. And I think that's where the problem begins. It is sort of treated as, I call it, the adaptive armor, where people may develop very high tolerance to stress or suppress emotions just to simply survive. So, although it is protective, it can make it harder to access your emotions or even have language to describe those emotions as well. And then again, the next last thing I want to talk about as well is just pushing through. I think it's a cultural message of perseverance, to keep going no matter what. Doesn't matter what you feel, doesn't matter what you're going through, just keep going. And that unfortunately reinforces avoidance of emotion and different somatic elements as well. So typically, people don't end up learning how to slow down, reflect, or even sit with the discomfort. So again, healing becomes slow down at that
Yeah.
rate as well. So again, I think part of the healing involves three things. It's naming these norms, these inherited norms, cultural norms. Second is reevaluating which adaptations are still needed. And third, it's learning how to allow safety and vulnerability and also rest as well. So, again, I think there's a lot of gray areas in talking about cultural norms. And I think I truly believe that it's a lot of finding that happy medium. And that happy medium could be 50-50, but it doesn't have to be. It could be 70-30 or 80-20, doesn't really matter as long as you are feeling okay with it. You are feeling regulated as much as you can.
Yeah. We, at the very top, talked a little bit about, some of the systemic issues like racism, displacement, war, poverty that cause or contribute to intergenerational trauma. I'm curious about what intergenerational trauma looks like in communities that maybe haven't historically had access to mental health care and what that looks like because that is also systemic in many places as well.
Absolutely. Yes. So I typically say trauma. So let's first maybe start with emotional kind of patterns that
Sure.
exist when or different communities don't have access to mental health care. And typically that is often managed very privately or collectively. So people may develop chronic anxiety, for example, or emotional suppression, hypervigilance, that is sort of normalized as that's just how life goes. So, for example, children start learning maybe to anticipate danger or loss, not because of a single event, but because their parents' nervous systems are operating in survival mode. So that can be very unhelpful at times, but again, that's also a survival means. And also, many folks don't have the language or even the space to even be open about those emotions. Second one, family dynamics. Parenting often reflects these survival strategies. So you might see things like high expectations, overprotection. So again, these patterns helped previous generations survive instability. But when when you don't have access to mental health care, what typically happens is that the roles within the family start becoming rigid. So with children taking, for example, children taking on adult responsibilities very early on in their life. And these behaviors are very protective and they can increase stress across generations. The next one I will say is cultural. I call it cultural transmission. So, again, what we talked about earlier, of like stories, rituals, it could be religion sometimes, or religious spiritual practices, all of that is up for grab when mental health care is not accessible. So many folks actually, and this is something that I tend to share with a lot of the clients that I see who struggle with this, is we tend to work together here and really be able to address the cultural practices that can be healing in itself. And that is the language that they understand. That is what they are familiar with. So we can use that as like a form of mental health support. And even if they don't have access to it, like different sort of communities, maybe religious institutions can sometimes serve that. Obviously, it doesn't equate to professional help. However, when the resources are limited, those are probably the best that that community might have access to. So
Yeah.
that's what I would say about that. Mm.
Yeah. And, there's this kind of term going around about like breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma. And I'm curious if, is that actually possible or is that a reasonable expectation when you're looking to kind of work through something like this? Um, because we've talked a lot about like how this can manifest, and there's a lot of steps of like identifying it and then working through it. So very curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, short answer, yes. But the healing journey is can be a long one because, as you said, there's a whole process in building the awareness, because the first step is understanding. That is truly the first step, which is awareness. But in order to lean into awareness, many of us may not know the stories of our great grandparents or our grandparents or even our parents' stories. And so part of it is not to emphasize that you need to know all the details. I don't think that is absolutely necessary, but it's more about the curiosity. It's more about leaning into that a little bit more. Trying to, if you have the option to ask your parents, your grandparents, fortunately, being able to do that can be very helpful. So it is recognizing the patterns in your family or culture, because it gives you the ability to finally respond consciously instead of automatically. Because I think our nervous system can have some of those automatic reactions without really knowing why. Why is this going on? And so naming these inherited patterns is the first step. I will say the second element of this is healing at the individual level. So this can include therapy, but it can also be things such as somatic practices. It could be mindfulness, breathing exercises. It could be reflective practices that help retrain the nervous system. So we really want to start working and practicing some of that emotional regulation piece as well. So that's
Yeah.
the second step, I will say. Third is parenting and using parenting and relationships as leverage points. So, one of the most powerful ways to break the cycle is changing relational patterns. So, when parents or caregivers consciously respond to stress rather than reacting from what they've known, which are survival strategies, children often experience safety and emotional attunement for the first time. So again, this doesn't erase history, it just creates new patterns of safety, trust, and regulation. Fourth, last one I will name as well as a way to break this cycle is community and cultural level healing. So, collective trauma can be mitigated through community support, storytelling, social change, or any type of ritual that align with you. So, again, healing isn't just personal, it is also collective, it is intergenerational. So, when communities acknowledge this historical harm and create those spaces for processing grief and resilience, they actually help stop the trauma from being silently transmitted. So I guess in a nutshell, yes, it's possible. It's just not about erasing all the history or pretending that the past did not happen.
Yeah.
So, and again, also want to let your listeners know that breaking the cycle doesn't happen overnight. It's just these small, very conscious choices that kind of ripple forward.
Yeah. And I have friends who are parents and they've talked a little bit about this with their own kids, but can healing happen if older generations are maybe unwilling or unable to participate?
Absolutely, yes. You can change your nervous system, create safety in relationships. All of that is up for grabs, even if the older generations are unwilling, unable to participate this, or maybe they simply may not even have the words or the language to heal from within, or maybe they're not even interested because as a South Asian therapist myself, I've seen within the South Asian diaspora specifically that there's a lot of stigma around talking about emotions, and that does play out in the older generations. And I typically say there is only one thing that you truly can focus on, which is changing your nervous system. You can't quite change your parents' thoughts, feelings. That's their own experience. But you know your thoughts. You have control over how you can regulate and have tools to be able to help yourself out. So that is the first step, is to work on sort of learning different skills or coping skills to be able to calm the nervous system down. Second, is I call it conscious reflection, and also rewriting patterns. So you can notice inherited behaviors. This is something in your power. And being able to choose sort of new ways of responding to the people in your life, right? So that might shake things up. It might be scary. There are going to be times perhaps that you might feel afraid to speak up or change, but naming, understanding these patterns and following through with that actually allows you to break these cycles, even if the older generations are continuing to operate from unresolved trauma. Third, you're able to create safety in relationships. So you don't need the older generation's participation in modeling healthy attachment, emotional expression, or even trust. For example, being able to trust your children if you're a parent, for example, or trusting your partner if you're like married, engaged, or in a relationship. So those things matter as well. And again, um, healing can truly honor the cultural like values, which I think the older generations are um, able to understand. And so typically, I will say to really lean into finding that common ground with the older generations, which includes cultural values. Maybe, for example, if you come from a collectivistic culture that really values harmony over individualism, for example, that is something that maybe you can sort of share, for example, in the process of setting boundaries with family members. You might be able to say, hey, I'm feeling this way, but is it okay if I take a breather here to be able to conserve my energy so that I'm able to be a better daughter for you or to be a better friend to you? So I always emphasize a lot of like language, cultural values, bring that back into the communication with the older generations because that is their language, and that can really help two generations align a little bit better.
Yeah. And sometimes I think you've talked a lot about um, the stress, the anxiety, these other feelings that crop up with this. Um, I think there's also a piece of this that I hear quite frequently about some um, maybe frustration, maybe anger that kind of comes with this. And I'm curious if you think that, forgiveness is maybe necessarily or necessary in this healing journey for people who hold some level of resentment to those who have come before them because of the way that they're, experiencing this now.
Yes, really good question. So, the answer is no. You don't necessarily need to forgive whoever it is, to be able to heal. So, I typically say healing doesn't require forgiving the past, right? Because forgiveness is often framed as a quote unquote must for moving on for a lot of people. But in intergenerational trauma, healing is more about reclaiming your nervous system and your life than absolving anyone in your life from the past, present. So you can process inherited patterns, regulate emotions, and build healthy relationships without forgiving those who caused harm, especially if they're no longer alive or unwilling to engage. Also, healing focuses a lot more on I call self sovereignty. So it's the goal. The goal is to separate your own choices from inherited survival strategies. So you are learning, I can respond differently, feel safe, and thrive, even if the past was harmful or someone did harm to me. So, this empowers you to interrupt that cycle as well. And also, forgiveness is optional. It is not, nobody is obligated to do so. So some people naturally move toward forgiveness as just a part of understanding and compassion, but others never do. So, and I typically say both can lead to deep healing. So the key is processing trauma and regulating the nervous system. And I think that those are the two things I tend to focus on. And also,
Yeah.
healing is also about integration as well, and not so much of approval. So you can really acknowledge and honor your ancestral struggles, but then also understand the context of their survival and still hold boundaries or recognize them as well. So again,
Right.
forgiveness is a choice, not so much a requirement. And I think healing is more focused on like awareness, self regulation, and just this conscious creation of these new patterns
Yeah.
is what's important, I think. Mm.
And for listeners who are, looking to either get started with this or continue in their healing journey, are there 1 to 3 small steps somebody can take to just get started or, to kinda continue on?
Mhm. Absolutely. So I have three that is coming to my mind. One is to be able to observe and reflect. So, noticing patterns in your emotions, behaviors, and relationships that often feel automatic or confusing. So, a question that I typically share with folks is this my own reaction or might it be inherited? So, things like journaling or reflective conversations can bring those unconscious patterns into awareness, which is the first step towards change. The second, I will say, is regulating your nervous system. So, examples of this could be even 5 to 10 minutes a day of breath work, grounding, or it can even be a gentle movement that can start retraining your nervous system. That could be going for a walk for 5 minutes, coming back. Like that can make a huge difference.
Yeah.
In terms of breath work, one of my favorites is taking a moment to inhale for 4 counts, exhaling for six, and noticing tension leaving your body as I continue to do multiple repetitions of that. That is one of my favorite breathwork techniques, and it really helps regulate your nervous system as well. Third, and this is my last step, which is creating conscious relational choices. So share this a lot with my clients, which is setting micro boundaries with family or friends when needed. So for example, stepping away from a triggering conversation or choosing not to re-engage in criticism. And also practicing vulnerability and healthy connection, where you can really model these new patterns. So I will say these are very small daily steps you can take, but it's going to have such a big impact on how your nervous system is coping with it.
And how can someone start these conversations within their family? Um, that can be, maybe a little daunting, maybe a little scary. So curious how you recommend just getting the ball rolling.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that's coming to my mind, which is first is start with awareness of cultural context. So again, I work with a lot of South Asian individuals. So many South Asian families emphasize respect for elders, saving face, just pushing through, which can really make trauma invisible or unspoken. So again, before approaching a conversation, you really want to reflect how might cultural expectations affect how I bring this up. So again, recognizing that silence or indirect communication is not lack of care. It is often a learned survival strategy. And a lot of collectivistic cultures tend to lean a little bit more into the indirect communication style rather than a direct communication style. So that is also just something to be aware of that can also um, help an individual become more in tune with conversations with family. Second is timing and relational context. I am someone who says typically there's never really a good time to bring up difficult conversations, but there's truly a time where it might get worse. So there's a few things I keep in mind, which is um, choosing a calm moment, if possible, when conversations may not escalate into conflict, shame, or even public embarrassment. So that might mean maybe start with one-on-one conversations with a parent. If that feels too daunting, maybe you have a trusted aunt, an uncle. If that also feels too daunting, maybe you have a cousin who you feel like she or he really understands you, or a friend even can make having these conversations, practicing the language as well, to become a lot more second nature, and you will feel a lot more confident in that way as well. Third is using cultural language and using curiosity. So I typically say you really want to start framing questions and comments in ways that honor family and tradition and not just blame. So I have a couple that I can share of to your listeners on how I would craft this language. So some examples I have here is I've been reflecting on how our family handles stress. Can you tell me stories about how you navigated hard times growing up? Another one could sound like this: I want to understand the challenges our family face so I can learn from them. So I really emphasize a lot of we, our, I tie it back a lot with family tradition, since many cultures are rooted in that collectivistic thinking perspective. And then the last one, or last two, I will say, is respecting boundaries and face saving. So you can still, I typically say respecting boundaries is not a language that I know a lot of South Asian families tend to are basically familiar with. So sometimes it's about using a different word or explaining it a little bit differently, or sometimes I share with clients and suggest using storytelling to be able to describe boundaries in some way. I think can be very, very powerful as well. So those are my suggestions on where you can get started.
Awesome. And if someone is thinking, you know what, I therapy is a next step for me. This is something that I want to do. What should they do when seeking a therapist for this type of work?
Yeah. So I will say, you first want to find a therapist that is trauma informed. So that means that they are very in tune with, for example, like family history, family systems, very in tune. Maybe they practice a lot of somatic practices, not just cognitive work, but also bridging the gap between the mind and the body is so essential in healing. from within. So that is really important. Second one I will say is having a very culturally aware and attuned therapist. Because so much of intergenerational trauma is linked to a lot of cultural beliefs, how families are being organized, how what are the values of the cultural system. So you truly want someone who really are able, if not aware, at least being able to have that conversation with you, I think is essential. So you can ask questions to whoever that therapist could be, such as, are you familiar with cultural norms around family, mental health, and emotional expression? Is like a question that I might suggest folks to ask whoever that therapist is. The next one is comfort with relational work, relational and systemic work. So, again, as we talked about earlier, this type of trauma shows up as family patterns, um, or social systems. So I typically say a good therapist should be very comfortable exploring those family dynamics, cultural stories, and really asking this question: how systemic oppression or migration experience may have shaped your family's patterns, I think is important. And I guess the next thing is being very collaborative and having this non-judgmental stance is absolutely crucial because many cultures, family systems that many of us may have been part of, haven't quite given many folks a space to share without that judgment. So I think just being very sensitive to that, and having a therapist who just listens with just curiosity, and if they don't know, being able to, having that conversation with you and being open in learning more, I think can be absolutely essential. And then one more thing to point out is emphasis on somatic work as well. So a therapist who may specialize in somatic therapy, EMDR is another very popular trauma informed type of therapy as well, or even trauma informed CBT. So that's like cognitive behavioral therapy, can also be very helpful as well. So as long as you sort of ask some of these questions, and if I know some of these types of therapies, not everybody's familiar with, that's okay. As long as you're having these conversations, a therapist can help answer any like worries, or um, ask you any questions you might have as well. So
Yeah. These have been such amazing tips. Thank you so much. I want to ask one last question, which is, if listeners take away just one message or one point from this conversation, what do you want that to be?
ooh, there's so many, but I will say the one takeaway is healing intergenerational trauma is not about fixing the past. It's truly about reclaiming your life, your nervous system, and your choices today. So it's just a reminder that you didn't cause the trauma, and you truly can regulate, and you have a lot of agency in what you're going through.
Amazing. Well, Shruti, thank you so much for joining us today. Like I said, this has been an amazing episode with so much information. If people want to learn more about you, learn more about this work, where can they go?
Yeah, absolutely. I also had a really fantastic time as well. But folks can reach me or connect with me. Follow me on Instagram and or TikTok at Bull Brown Therapist. Also, I am currently accepting new clients in New York, so feel free to visit my website at www.shrutinayar.com. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have, and start your healing journey if you feel ready to do so. So, thank you, Julie, for having me on. And I truly had a wonderful time. So, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And thanks everybody for listening, and tune in next week for another great episode.